Welcome to SciPol SoundBites, the official podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. In these special podcast episodes celebrating JSPG's 10th anniversary, we'll speak with former JSPG staff, executives, authors, editors, and more about how JSPG started and where it's come from, how it's evolved and where it's going, and what opportunities it provides for the next generation of early career science policy innovators. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the special SciPol SoundBites podcast season, celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, or JSPG for short. My name is Aaron Conrado, JSPG's podcast director and producer, and your host, as always. Thank you for joining us today. So for those of you new to JSPG, JSPG is an international open access peer-reviewed publication dedicated to elevating students, postdocs, policy fellows, and early career scholars in science, technology, and innovation policy and governance debate worldwide. So for this second episode in our anniversary series, I want to take some time to sit down and talk with JSPG's founder, Max Bronstein, to talk about how the idea for JSPG was developed, how it got off the ground, and the challenges in doing so, how it's evolved since then, and how it's grown to support and shape the next generation in policy. So Max Bronstein is the founder of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. He holds a master's in public policy and a graduate certificate in science policy from the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. His undergraduate degrees are in biology, like me, and writing composition from Ithaca College. Max has held positions at the National Science Foundation, the U.S. House Committee on Science and Technology, the University of Michigan, the National Institutes of Health, and the Michigan Journal of Public Affairs. Max has significant consulting experience in government affairs and nonprofit services with a focus on science and technology policy. He is the former director of science policy at Research America and the chief advocacy and science policy officer of the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, and former senior director of health policy and corporate affairs at Audentes Therapeutics. Max currently works as an assistant director in the OSTP Health and Life Sciences team. Max, welcome to the podcast. Quite the bio there.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Glad to have you. And today I'm also joined by JSPG's current CEO and managing publisher, who you all know well, Adriana Bankston, who will help to facilitate some of the questions for today's session. Adriana, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in. I really want to learn some more about our main speaker today, Max. To get us kind of kicked off, I'm curious to know, how did you get into the world of science policy, and maybe talk about, how your career path has progressed from, when you first got into science policy to where you are now, and a little bit more about your current role.
Yeah, happy to dive in here. And thank you for the question, Aaron, and for holding today's session. So I think like many people who've been involved with the journal, they are either practicing scientists or they started as scientists, which is exactly where my career began. And so I knew enough when I was going into college that I knew I wanted to be involved with science. And when you're starting as an undergrad, there's not really many options to think about science more broadly. It's typically you have to go in and you major in some scientific field. And if you're lucky, and you might get some exposure at that period to science policy or science and society, or maybe the history of technology, so that you can gain some broader awareness of how science came to be and why we do it, and the way it sort of functions within society. So I sort of started in that area as a biologist. And one of the things that was really, I think, helpful to me in my career is I started doing research very early. I mean, I was in the lab as a freshman doing research, and just sort of talked myself into that because, I knew if I was going to have a career in this field, I wanted to get a feel for what it would be like to be basically in the trenches of a lab on a day-to-day basis. And it was a phenomenal experience. But one of the things I learned after doing multiple research experiences was, I don't think I could be in a lab for 10 hours a day. And not to say that that's not incredibly important work, but it wasn't the right fit for my personality and what I wanted to do. So over time, I realized that I wanted to continue to be involved in science and continue to support the scientific endeavor. but maybe not as the guy working in a lab all day. So, when I finished my undergrad work, I moved back to DC, which is where I'm from originally, and sort of scrambled to find work because I think, like a lot of undergrads, you get out, you finally have this shiny degree, and some of us are saddled with a lot of debt, and so yeah, you need to figure out what to do and what to do pretty quickly. So I ended up doing some odd jobs initially, and thankfully landed at NSF, the National Science Foundation, which was basically in the backyard of where I grew up. So that was really my first experience in a formal science policy role, and it was just totally foundational in helping me recognize the broader environment that science occurs in, and the sort of linkages between society and the critical and irreplaceable role that government plays in making science happen in the US and across the world too.
Well, well, great. That's great to hear. Seems like you took a similar, trajectory to many of us who get involved in science policy, who start off, I'm gonna go be a scientist. And then we realize after doing some actual scientists, like, I don't know if I can do this all day, every day for the next 30 or 40 years, but I still want to remain involved, in the scientific enterprise. And then finding that niche, that's great that you got to jump in at NSF and sort of explore that broader context. So how has that led you to what you're doing now? If you can talk a little bit more kind of like your career path from there and what you're currently doing at OSTP.
Yeah. So that experience I just described, working at the National Science Foundation, that was about 15 years ago. So a lot has happened since then in terms of my career, and certainly the world has changed pretty radically since that period in time. So, when I was working there, I had the great opportunity to work under the deputy director and the director of NSF, and they, both basically became mentors of mine and really pushed me to ask the tough questions about what do I want to do with my life and what do I want to do after NSF. I hope they weren't trying to throw me out of the organization, but it was just great that they were there to push me to think about that and think very strategically about it. So after spending about 2 years there, I started looking for graduate programs because I got my first sort of taste of science policy, and I was like, all right, I'm hooked. This is what I need to do with my time and my life. So from there, actually went on to the University of Michigan, which I think you mentioned at the outset, and they have not only a school of public policy, but also a certificate program that actually allows folks to really hone in on science and technology policy. And that was pretty unique at the time when I was there. There were not many graduate schools offering that type of opportunity. And I really enjoyed it because it allowed me to take classes across various schools in the university. So it was School of Engineering, Business School, Environmental Science. So it gave that sort of multidisciplinary lens that I think you really need to be successful in the science policy field. I also had the opportunity to teach an undergrad class in national science policy with Homer Neal, who was formerly on the JSPG advisory board and actually literally wrote the textbook on science policy. So that was an unbeatable experience. And at the same time, during one of the summers, I had to do basically a graduate internship, which I did with the House Science Committee. So had all those experiences in a 2-year period. And when I finished graduate school, that's actually when I founded the journal, because I got some experience working in journals and realized that, okay, this is an incredibly important space, especially for young people to be in, and we don't have a venue for them to be in. So I'm happy to talk more about the journal piece and how we got to where we are today. But that was another important step in my own career, which was really diving in on the nonprofit side and thinking about how to successfly start up a nonprofit organization, which is a pretty unique skill and skill set. So those were some of the really important pieces of my earlier career, and then really got involved in advocacy and worked as the policy director at Research America, and spent a lot of time really advocating, going to Congress, trying to educate them about why funding for health research was so critical. The irony was that I had started that job at the pretty much the zenith of power of the Tea Party, which I know this might be dating myself a little bit, but these were folks who were very oriented towards smaller government and less government spending. And here I was showing up saying we need to do the opposite of that, which created some interesting conversations on Capitol Hill, but ones that were ultimately successful in ensuring continued bipartisan support for health research, which is always great to see when that happens. And from there, I spent 3 years working with Research America and doing advocacy, and I started thinking about my next moves, and actually decided to take a break from all of my career stuff and just basically sold almost everything I owned and went to the other side of the world and traveled for what ended up being about 9 months of travel abroad, which was an extremely fun, like once in a lifetime type experience, which if you can swing it, I highly recommend everyone take time to do that type of thing in life. And I say that because, we're all going to be probably working well into our 70s at the rate society is going here. So, what is it to take 3 months or 6 months or 9 months to do something that you might never have the chance to do later in life? So highly recommend that. And so when I finished that little, we'll call it a sabbatical, I came back, and as you would expect, I was like, oh, there's a limit to what my bank account can do. And it was time to get back in the workforce, and decided to basically move to California, to the Bay Area. I knew that was a place I wanted to live, but ended up moving there without a job, which pretty risky to move to the most expensive city in the US without a job. So wouldn't necessarily recommend that piece of it, but it ended up working out very well for me in the sense that I connected with a fantastic nonprofit that was doing advocacy for patients with rare and sort of untreated conditions, and over time became the chief policy and advocacy person at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, and did that for 3 years, and then worked at a startup gene therapy company that was headquartered in San Francisco. So went through all of those sort of career opportunities, and the gene therapy company ended up getting acquired, which happens very typically in the biotech world, especially when you're at a small company. And I left after that acquisition, started my own consulting firm, simultaneously had started doing work on the what at the time was the Biden-Harris campaign. And obviously they when they won, I had the opportunity to come meet with some of the folks who ended up in OSTP and have been there ever since. So it's been a little over a year in the role at OSTP, working on a whole variety of issues, which I'm happy to spend some time talking about as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you've had quite the journey. I thought it was interesting when you said you started the journal right after graduate school, because the immediate response to my brain was like, oh, because he had free time again. So he could do fun things like start a journal. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear more about your work at OSTP, but I also want to make sure that we get to, kind of talking about sort of the start and the evolution of JSPG, as this is a great opportunity having the founder here with us. So I think I'll toss it over to Adriana to ask a few questions about that.
Yeah, thank you. And excited to be here and hear more about your thought process when starting JSPG. So I'll sort of just ask you the first question, because this is what we really want to know is what went through your mind in terms of, the journal is something that, needs to exist. Why, did you think about creating it, and how did you come up with the idea? And then I'll ask you more specifics.
Yeah. So, this is many years ago now, but when I had finished grad school, I had the opportunity to work at the Michigan Journal of Public Affairs. So I sort of saw how publishing could work and how it could work very well. So I had that sort of skill set coming into it. The other thing that I realized, and I'm still frustrated by this today, is if you look at the majority of publications, most of the time when an early career person wants to publish, they can't do it under their own name or their own banner. They end up sort of hitching their wagon to whoever their PI is, some professor who's long tenured, long established in the world. And I would actually argue that that's not very good for innovation. And I say that because it's typically, not always, typically like the younger early career people they're not as afraid to take risks. They might propose wildly different ideas, things that are really bold. And it's just harder to do that when publications are basically gated to having to publish with someone who is already very well established in the field and has done that using what are probably pre-established hypotheses. So I wanted to create a venue where young people could, and early career people, not just young people, but early career folks could really put forward what were bold, out of the box, risky things that, yeah, maybe they would be hard to achieve, but if they did, would be truly transformational in advance, whether it be solving climate change, curing cancer, doing some of these other really tough societal challenges. I think it was a really nice opportunity to do that. The other piece of it is just sort of a functional one, and it's just hard to publish when you don't have a track record. It's really tough to do that because you're competing against the tenured professors of the world, folks who might have dozens or even hundreds, in some cases, of publications under the belt already, and that just didn't seem fair to me. So wanted to create a new pathway there. The other piece of this is that if you've ever worked as someone who works at an agency or worked in Congress and you're a policymaker yourself, you probably are not reading every word of every scientific journal article that comes out. And that's a good thing, because honestly, if you did that, you would never get your job done. So I wanted to create another venue that would sort of meet policymakers halfway, in the sense that it could actually have a format that a policymaker could pick up this publication, read everything they need to know within 5 minutes or less, and then that would inform their decision making on whatever policy area they are working on. And that's why having a policy memo that has clear recommendations, that has clear summaries for policymakers, for executives, that as a format has not really existed in the world of academic publishing. And I felt that was a significant missed opportunity. So it was sort of all that constellation of things that I was like, so we need to just create a totally new product here, because this is just not something that exists in the world today. So I would be remiss in not thanking some of the mentors and early stage advisory board members who literally signed on to support this and lend their names to this. I think I gave them nothing more than a one-page summary of what was going on in my head at the time. And every one of them, almost without any hesitation, just said, yes, you can, add us to the advisory board. We'll support you and we'll help you. So none of this would have been possible were it not for that early stage support from some of those advisory board members.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. And I think as CEO now, but a lot of folks who have been involved with the journal over the years, I think we're really motivated by the mission and creating this space for early career researchers to publish. And as you said, try to leverage some of the published work to policymakers, which is sort of part of my goal now and sort of the next phase, I think. But so you mentioned that, and I agree that it's tough for early career folks to find places to publish. I think also for the journal itself to establish, I imagine you ran into some challenges and hurdles, competing with probably current publishers or, other ways to sort of establish the journal. So that's sort of my next question is, how do you start from scratch and establish something like this that is sustaining, and 10 years later we're still here and really exciting to be involved. But what did it take to do it in the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, it took I'd say willingness to take risks and not to be afraid of screwing something up or just outright failing at it. And I didn't even know enough at the time to know when I was screwing something up. But the best part about it was, none of that stopped me from trying. because I felt like I had a clear vision for what the journal could be and what it should be. And I didn't know exactly how to get there. And, nowadays, after having worked at multiple nonprofits and started nonprofits and done fundraising and dealt with, filing all kinds of government forms to get your nonprofit status, like there's so much more that I know now that I just had no clue about back then. And this is why, in working with some of my mentors and other folks who were early supporters of this, they really were the ones who sort of connected me with the resources to fill in the dots and get to the point where, okay, this is not just an idea on a piece of paper. This is a certified 501c3 nonprofit that has board and staff of volunteers and all of that. So all of those things were important. I will say that fundraising in this space was always a challenge, and I'm sure it remains challenging. And I think that's true for every nonprofit organization. I think it's particularly true for JSPG, just because of the fact that the whole field of publishing has changed very dramatically over the last 20 years. So a lot of the business models that made sense, whether they were subscription or otherwise, are not necessarily viable anymore. So I think that is always going to be a challenge, and always a place where folks at the journal will continue to need to innovate and think really sort of big picture, out of the box ways to make that work. But those are some of the pieces that I remember being particularly challenging early on. The thing that I was overwhelmed with was the first call for editors that went out. The number of people who applied and wanted to be part of this, even though, there was no money involved, it was just going to be taking people's time. There were so many just really talented, thoughtful graduate students who wanted to get behind this and get this as an experience. So that was incredible to see. And as soon as that happened, I was like, okay, I've definitely hit on something, and there's a real demand and desire and need for this out there. So those were some of my early memories of starting the journal.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. And I'm wondering if you have any lessons learned, sort of things you wish you knew, things you wish you had done differently when you started out, maybe for other founders looking to do something like this.
Yeah, I think going out there and identifying mentors who can connect you with pro bono services is a really important tactic and strategy even. So there are lots of fantastic law firms out there, and there are many folks who actually do have practices in the nonprofit area. And you would be surprised. You can cold email some of these folks or cold call them, and many of them will not only get back to you, but many of them actually tithe time to doing sort of pro bono nonprofit work. And you would be very surprised how helpful they are willing and able to be. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be working for you on a pro bono retainer or anything like that. But if you go in with a specific set of questions and you've done your homework and you've done your research and you're asking the right questions, like they can help you really build an organization from scratch. And in many cases, they won't even ask for a dime for doing this. So I have a lot of respect for the legal folks out there who continue to provide those types of services to either folks who are looking to start up nonprofits or who are already running nonprofits and just are in need of pro bono legal advice on all manner of topics. So that's certainly one piece that, had I known that at the time, I would have done a lot more of that type of activity. And the other thing I've realized over time is when you are really good at communicating what your mission is as a nonprofit, people will line up to help you. And I'm not just talking about lawyers, but people really will find time to volunteer, maybe to donate, or just to offer some advice about how to achieve a goal or make something happen that you want to get your nonprofit to the next level. So that's really about like honing your pitch and getting very good at connecting with people and making sure that they understand on an emotional level why this is such an important endeavor.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I found as well that there's a lot of folks getting behind the mission of what we're doing, and they're willing to give their time for, reviewing and being on panels and that sort of thing to really help elevate the published work as well. So it's been nice to see. So I'm gonna just deviate a little bit from this, because I think moving into the future and looking, sort of where you were. So we talked about sort of the beginning, but how do you see your initial vision for the journal matching with where it is now and sort of the evolution? Any sort of predictions for the next 10 years or things you'd like to see? Let's go from there.
Yeah, I remember starting this up and looking back on those days and comparing to where the journal is now. I would have never anticipated. I mean, podcasting at the time was a very exotic thing. So the fact that we're even having this conversation in this medium is remarkable to me. And when I look back at some of the editions that have been published and the sheer number of authors who have had that opportunity to publish, it's very fulfilling to see that, because I know that when I was at that stage of my career, when I was first getting published, it was really the first time that I felt like I was being recognized as a scholar, and really felt like the folks in the field had said, this is a novel idea and it's worthy of being published. So that feeling of confidence and of fulfillment and sort of professional acceptance that you get when your publication gets out there, I mean, there's nothing quite like that in the world of student scholarship. So I would love to see even more authors have that opportunity. And I love the fact that the journal has sort of moved out into different types of policy areas that when I was envisioning the journal, didn't even think anyone would care to want to publish in. So it's great to see that expansion and the international components too, because, if you think about the big challenges facing the world today, whether it's future pandemics, climate change, dealing with how we create an equitable access environment for healthcare products, all of those are global challenges. Each country can work on them individually, but if you want to truly solve any of those challenges, there has to be international participation there. So just really excited to see the journal working in that area, and can't wait to see continued progress on that side.
Well, that's really nice to hear. As sort of 1 year plus into the role, and really have tried to expand on all those areas that you mentioned, and it does seem to resonate with folks who are overseas as well, and really trying to be timely with the conversations going on right now around open science and diplomacy, and that's really helped expand our reach as well. So kind of building on this question of you mentioned build confidence and having, again, giving early career folks a place to publish and really use that work in their careers. What is sort of a broader question of what JSPG brings to the next generation in science policy, right? Whether they're students, they'll be the next leaders in whatever initiative, I think, and we're facilitating that for them. But any sort of long-term vision in terms of what the journal can do for the next generation?
Yeah. I mean, one of the other reasons I started the journal was because I really wanted to give early career folks a strong voice in the policy making process. And it's one thing for someone to write a letter to a member of Congress, or maybe show up on Capitol Hill and do meetings, but it's something else to publish and to have the sort of credential of a publication. That's something that I think can really be a helpful tool for doing policy change. So that to me is something that is hopefully going to continue to be really useful to the authors who have published with the journal. I would also say that one of the amazing things that I've seen about the journal, and this has a little bit to do with the way society is moving these days, but the way we communicate is completely different than the way we communicated 15, 20 years ago, where so much of it is happening on social media. It's happening in the format of podcasts. It's happening in conversations like these in Zoom. So, seeing the journal work in those areas and adapt to sort of new communication paradigms to get messages from authors out there, I think is really important to see and really fulfilling to see as well. Because, if you want to be effective in advocacy, step one is being effective in communication.
Yes, definitely great points. And this sort of goes to my next question is, where does JSPG sort of fit into the policy ecosystem, right? You mentioned the international expansion. It's part of, sort of training the next generation in research and writing and publications. We've seen have helped a lot of students who are going into fellowships and really their careers as well. But what is sort of your big picture kind of vision of where it fits in more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see it be sort of go-to resource for policymakers in a variety of areas. That has always been sort of the intent in design, and that's why we publish in a more innovative format than most journals that work on policy issues, is because we want to be immediately relevant to decision making. And part of that means being able to publish pieces and turn them around, not in a 6-month to 8-month time frame, but in a matter of weeks, because there are so many big decisions out there that get made very quickly. And I will speak as a policymaker, having resources on hand that you can use to make those decisions in an informed and educated way is extremely helpful to have. So I would love to see the journal continue to be sort of a go-to resource for folks in the policy world.
Yeah, we've actually had recently a few authors go to DC and talk to policymakers about their research, and it's the first time I've heard that. It may have happened before and we didn't know, but really trying to keep track of that and where that's actually being leveraged on the Hill, and the conversations they're having, because that's one of the things I'm sort of trying to foster too, is these conversations actually happening around published ideas and sort of where do we take these ideas after a publication, right? Which I think is looking to the future in that sense. Yeah.
And the other, interesting piece of this, which this never occurred to me when I was envisioning the journal, but not only have policymakers been picking this up, it's getting picked up in various media sources too. So what that tells me is reporters are now finding these articles and citing them in some news articles, which is fantastic to see. I mean, so many researchers out there will literally spend 40 years working on some niche issue in science, and it might never actually see the light of day in a mass media publication. So the fact that JSPG is breaking through in that way is incredibly remarkable, not only for the authors whose work is being cited in those venues, but it's I think very helpful to have another tool for reporters who are a critical part of democracy and a critical part of dealing with some of the challenges that we face in society around misinformation and science education. So the fact that they are leveraging JSPG as a tool to inform their reporting is fantastic.
Yeah, great point there. Definitely, that's another ongoing effort to utilize the media more, definitely. So my last question, and you sort of touched on this in the beginning in terms of JSPG playing a role in your career. Is there sort of, again, that longer term vision of, how you think this played a role in your own development and policy?
Yeah, I think, in my earlier part of my career, when I was doing a lot of work with nonprofits, when I was interviewing for those jobs, being able to say that I had founded a nonprofit, that usually got people's attention, because it's, I think it's an unusual credential. And some people would look at me and they look at me like I have a screw loose or something like that, because for folks who've been through the process, not always a pleasant one, and it takes a lot of time and energy, and you truly have to be dedicated to get a nonprofit off the ground. So I think it was helpful for all those reasons. And the other piece of this is that the journal is so broad in what it covers in the science policy world that it gives you exposure to an incredible number of areas in science policy. I mean, you can read through 2 or 3 editions and you cover energy, you cover health, you cover pandemics. There's just so many aspects of science policy that are covered in one venue and in a relatively short space that it gave me this really broad lens through which to look at science policy and how you can make connections between society and all the various components of government that play a role here. So those pieces were really helpful to me in my career. And hopefully, having for authors who have published with the journal, having that credential on their CV or their resume is something that helps them stand out, especially if they want to have a career in science policy.
Yeah, I think it definitely does. And I can also speak to this from the staff and CEO perspective, that I think it's helped a lot of professionals who are starting out in the field and having these leadership positions, and being on staff with the journal. You learn a lot of skills that aren't necessarily policy, but just leadership and supervising other people, that sort of thing. And really learning how to lead an organization is definitely something to take away from this for us as well. So we appreciate that legacy in a way that you've given us to have the opportunity to be in these roles now. So that's really all I had. So I'll turn it back to Aaron for a few more questions before we close.
Thank you, Adriana. Yeah, kind of just to go off of what you were just saying, talking about, developing skills. I'm curious to ask Max, for especially, early career researchers who are trying to break into the science policy world, what are the kinds of skills that they should be trying to develop, do you think? What are the skills that have made you successful in your career? And then how can they use those skills to make an impact on science policy through JSPG?
Yeah, so I sort of alluded to this earlier, but I think one of the key skill sets is around being an effective communicator, and that there's a lot of dimensions to that. One of the dimensions means you have to be able to take could be a really complex scientific idea or concept and break it down to, some people say middle school level, I go a level below that, elementary school level, and you really have to be able to explain it to someone who, if you have any 9 or 10-year-olds in your family, if you can explain it to them, like, yeah, a member of Congress should understand where you're coming from, or anyone else who you need to communicate with. So really practicing and honing that skill of taking, really complex, big ideas like solving climate change and explaining them in a way that is not only understandable, but will actually compel someone to take action. So that's one piece of it. I think the other has a lot to do and can kind of be summed up with a very simple saying, which is you should make your policy fit their politics. And what I mean by that is you might have the best policy idea in the history of policy ideas, or at least you feel that way about it, but you always need to be very mindful about who you are communicating with and what their goals are. And how can you sort of fit your policy into the political goals that they want to see achieved? So, if you are communicating with a member of Congress and you're trying to convince them to make investments in some sort of climate change adaptation, you might want to talk to them about job creation, for example. How could your policy lead to more jobs for their district, or different jobs for the economy, something that every member of Congress is perennially concerned about, right? So that's a big piece of it is really, I think, doing the first part, which is like listening to the audience and then figuring out how to persuade them. Because I've seen a lot of people go in to these situations where they are just so convinced that they are the smartest person in the room and that their solution is the best solution. And if you go in with that bias and that mindset, I don't think you're going to be successful in those conversations, because it's should really start with listening to what the other side is looking to accomplish, and then figuring out how to sort of frame your argument using the goals of the audience in that argument. So those are some of the skills that I think are almost universally helpful and applicable across the field of folks who want to get involved in science policy.
Yeah, and then I think JSPG kind of gives a great platform to sort of hone and practice those skills, to actually put that communication out there in the world, to be mindful of your audience when you're writing your publication. And then to use that as a platform then to kind of go out, right, and engage with these different policymakers and, kind of almost try out, see if what you wrote will be effective, if it will change somebody's mind, if it will then actually turn into action. So I think it's a great avenue to do that. Just in closing, I just wanted to ask you, is there any other advice or any other sort of resources you would suggest for early career researchers who are interested in science policy?
Yeah, I would say explore as many opportunities as you can, or as early as possible in your career. So, does that mean doing internships? Does it mean doing fellowships? Does it mean finding someone who you think has a really cool job in the field and just finding time to get coffee with them, or maybe volunteer to do some like internship like work for them? So I think the best thing you can do is just get as many experiences as you can, figure out what you don't like, figure out what you do like, and because you're early in your career, and many of these opportunities will probably come in the form of internships and fellowships. You're not really committed to them. They're very low risk, and most of them don't last particularly long. So just take as much time as you need and as you can get to explore and find something that's really going to be a good fit for you, and something that makes you feel fulfilled at the end of the day. Because if you're not feeling fulfilled with what you're doing with your career, then that's probably a signal that it's time to look for something different. So go out there, find things that are fun, that excite you, that you wake up every morning and actually there's some thought in your head that says, I can't wait to get back at this again, because that's what's going to keep you happy and keep you motivated, and hopefully create an environment where you're going to have some really cool advocacy policy successes as well down the road.
Well, that's inspiring advice to me, especially as an early career scientist who's been doing that kind of, I'll go try this, I'll go try that, I'll try a little bit of this. Makes me feel like I'm on the right track. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries. The one other piece of advice, I think I alluded to this, but the importance of mentors cannot be overstated. So if there is a person out there, or maybe there's not a person out there, maybe there's an organization and you just think they're doing the coolest work, the most innovative, cutting edge stuff, try to find an opportunity, a way to connect with them. I often tell people that they should not be requesting informational interviews. I think that word interview is something that often turns people off who are really busy. So instead, just go in with flattery and say, hey, I think you have a really cool job. You have an incredible background. I would love to find 15 minutes to get coffee, pick your brain over Zoom, whatever the request is. I think that approach is far more likely to get someone to respond and to want to share their background, as opposed to going in and asking for a job interview from someone you don't know, which to me is always a strange ask. So instead, just go in, be very casual about it, and see if most folks are more than happy to spend time talking about their experience and sharing their wisdom with early career folks and younger people especially. So would encourage people on this Zoom to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you see that, in academia, even when you want to engage someone, ask them about their research, they'll chalk your ear off. And I think when you find people in science policy who love what they're doing, it's the same thing. You're like, hey, I really like what you're doing, I want to hear more. They're like, yeah, they'll talk your ear off, and then can really build that connection and learn from it and see if it's something that might interest you. Yeah. Well, Max, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate all this, all the thoughts you've provoked, I should say, and this great perspective on JSPG, especially, coming from its inception. I think it'll be a really cool piece to add with all of our different interviews we're doing as we kind of look back and look forward on the history of JSPG. And thank you, Adriana, as well, for joining us today. And I'm sure everybody listening has learned a lot about the journal, about its history, about the science policy enterprise, and how they can sort of build those skills and plug in. I know I have. So if you are listening, I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can certainly find it and others like it on JSPG's website. That's sciencepolicyjournal.org. You can also find it on our channels on YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you listen to all of your favorite podcasts. And please stay tuned for future episodes in this series and for other activities we'll have planned coming up in the next few months as we continue to celebrate JSPG's 10-year anniversary. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to all your favorites. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal. Thanks for tuning in.